The most cooperative species on Earth is our own human species. And that's really because we can mutually benefit so much by sharing things with each other. We can share resources, we can share our ideas, we can share our brute strength, and mutually benefit by it. So the logic is there of mutual benefit for us to get together and cooperate. And our cooperative behaviour is so much more sophisticated than other species because of our advanced cognitive powers and our language. That means we can negotiate with each other linguistically, we can read subtle facial signals and therefore judge people's trustworthiness, we can recall who we've interacted with in the past, and we can recall how they dealt with us in the past. We can move from relatively trivial end of the spectrum, from say tipping a waiter, up to the other end of the scale where people are known to have risked their own lives to save somebody drowning. People in the Second World War risked their lives in sheltering Jews from the Nazis, for example. And even at the trivial end of tipping a waiter or a taxi driver, the interesting thing there in understanding human nature is that one is not going to be reciprocated. That is pure altruism, and that's a really intriguing aspect of human nature, that we are willing to give to others without any thought of return. Our cooperative nature started in early human social groups when we were hunter-gatherers a couple of 100,000 years ago. And in these groups of up to 100 or 150, everybody knew everybody else. These were long-term stable groups and people got to know each other, so that if one person was very helpful to another person, this would be observed by third parties, and also those third parties would talk about what they'd seen, and by gossip, a person's reputation for cooperation would quickly go around the group. So the concept of reputation is a crucial one here, that people knew everybody else in the group and they got to know how cooperative they were. And cooperation evolved by what is now termed indirect reciprocity. It wasn't that there was direct reciprocity, so if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, but that if one person helps another person, that second person helps the third person, and all that is seen by the others, and the third person might then help the first person. So what goes around comes around. The way that cooperation is studied now is partly with laboratory experiments developed by economists in the area that's known as game theory. To give you an example, a very simple game, but that is very powerful in telling us about our cooperative nature, is the ultimatum game. This is a game between two people. The first person, who is called the proposer, has a certain amount of money. You can imagine that you tell the proposer that they've just found a £10 note in the street, and that the second person comes along not quite finding it early enough, and they might have been the first person to find it, but they're the second person, and the first person is asked to say how much they would be willing to give from nothing to everything of that £10 to the second person, who is the receiver. The receiver then has a decision to make. If the receiver accepts the offer of the proposer, then both take the share as offered, and that's the end of the game. But if the receiver says no to the offer, if the receiver rejects the offer, then neither party get anything. Now, the rationally selfish way to play this game is for the receiver to accept the smallest possible offer, because something is better than nothing, say a penny, and therefore for the proposer to offer a penny. But that is not what people do. Very interestingly, and this game has been played around the world in many societies, the proposer offers 20, 30, 40%, sometimes 50%, sometimes more. That's a very simple experiment, but it tells us something profound about our nature. And it tells us really, and other studies back this up, that there seems to be a universal sense of fairness. The receiver in this sort of experiment will reject an offer typically below roughly about 20%. So that is also intriguing. They are if you like, spiting themselves. They are missing out on, say, £2 worth out of £10 when they might have had it, because again, they don't think it's fair. And they are ensuring that the proposer gets nothing, even though they get nothing. Another sort of similar interpretation within the same sort of logic is in terms of reputation. The proposer wants to maintain a good reputation and so is offering a good amount. The receiver doesn't want to be seen to have a sucker's reputation and so is rejecting very small amounts. So that game tells us one important thing about our cooperative nature, and that's a sense of fairness which runs through these things. Another game with a number of people involved is called the public goods game. It might have 5 people in it, 10 people in it. In this, you imagine that there is some public good, say a community enterprise, that the individuals in the experiment are donating to. Each of, let's say, 5 individuals is given a pot of money at the beginning, let's say £10, and they are asked on a number of rounds of the experiment how much they would like to donate to the public good of, say, let's say, setting up a nursery school, for one example. For every £1 that they contribute, that amount is doubled by a notional bank, and it goes towards the community activity, and the individuals keep the rest. The rational way to play this game is to give nothing, because for every £1 you give, that £1 is doubled, but it's divided by, say, 5 people. So you end up with less than £1. You'd be better to keep your £1 than to have it doubled and shared out and you're left with, say, 40p. If you give all of your money, and if everybody gives all of their money, then it's doubled, it's shared out, and everybody ends up with twice as much as they put in. I should say, what I mean here is that they end up with twice as much in the communal activity that they're donating to. So, if you like, £20 worth of activity in the nursery rather than £10 in their pocket. But it's their good, as their share of a public good. The dilemma here is that if everybody gives the maximum amount, everybody will get double what they put in. But the temptation is always to put no money in at all, because even if everybody else puts all their money in, each individual still does the best if they put no money in. But of course, if everybody acts in this way and puts no money in, they go home with what they started with. You come in with £10 and you go home with £10, whereas you could have gone home with £20 worth of communal activity. So that is the logic of how the game works in terms of whether one behaves selfishly or cooperatively. So what do people do? Well, as with the ultimatum game, they do not behave selfishly. Typically people contribute, say, 20 or 30% of their pot of, say, £10. So again, they are behaving in a cooperative fashion. A third example of the study of cooperation, I'll turn to a real-world example now, and this is the phenomenon of what is called common pool resources, worked on by the economist Elinor Ostrom. These are examples are coastal fisheries, irrigation systems, forestry systems, agricultural systems, where a group of people locally work together. They've come together and decided on how to extract the resource, how to work the fisheries, how to work the agriculture. And there are a lot of these systems around the world that do work. Some political theorists have claimed that this kind of cooperation would never work, and that the only way to exploit resources is either to have private ownership or to have some sort of superordinate government control, because individuals cannot be trusted to be cooperative and to get on with each other and to work this sort of system. But Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues have uncovered dozens of cases around the world where these systems work, and she's logged the kind of attributes of these systems that make them work, and they can work. I've talked about cooperation between individuals, and we can think of those individuals working within a social group. But of course, social groups can be in conflict with other social groups. So there's a tension here between what's happening within a group and what's happening between groups. And a very ubiquitous phenomenon in social life is something called the in-group, out-group phenomenon. People very easily identify themselves with a group. At work, at play, in all kinds of ways. We are all parts of different and overlapping groups. And it's a very strong part of human nature to favour individuals within your group and to discriminate against people who are in different groups. This is a great cause of conflict around the world and differences between communities. Living closely together but not getting on with each other is this powerful in-group, out-group phenomenon. It was first shown to be so powerful experimentally in the 1960s by a social psychologist, Henri Tajfel, who set up this kind of discrimination in 12-year-old schoolboys simply by telling them that they were in a group that liked one abstract painter rather than another abstract painter, then asking them how much they would reward individuals in their own group or the other group, and finding that they would reward another boy in this apparently the same group more than they would a boy in another group, even to the extent that they would spite themselves or spite other members of their supposed group in getting less than they might get, as long as they get more than the other group. So it's very easy to set up these distinctions in people's minds, and they are very divisive. But another aspect of this, and it's a part of the theorizing now about the evolution of cooperation, some of the models are showing that cooperation is favoured even more so if the group is acting in hostility with other groups. So when one thinks of groups interacting with other groups in a hostile way, then cooperation within the group can act in a favourable way when they are acting against other groups. And this may have been an important part of the evolution of our cooperative nature. There are also cultural differences in these games that I've talked about. The ultimatum game has been played in small-scale societies, pastoral societies, hunting societies, agricultural societies around the world. And it's found that there is more cooperation in those groups that show more cooperation in their daily lives outside the family, and also in those groups that have more of a market economy, that are trading with other peoples. For example, herders who are buying and selling cattle, or who sometimes are working for wages. So if the culture of a people favours cooperation in their daily lives, we find that, not surprisingly, that there is more cooperation in these games, and this is a diversity between the cultures. Another study in the public goods game shows wide cultural diversity. There's a phenomenon in the public goods game called antisocial punishment. This is where individuals are enabled to use some of their pot of money to punish other individuals. Now, social punishment, pro-social punishment, is where an individual will punish those who have been rather mean to encourage them to be more generous in following rounds. So the fact that people will do that is interesting. People will give up some funds to encourage cooperation in others. But also, rather less socially, there is antisocial punishment when people punish others who have given more than others. These are usually people who have punished them for them being mean, and they want revenge, and they will punish those who have been more generous. When that happens, the whole cooperative system tends to just spiral out of control, and contributions go down and down and down. So this game with the antisocial punishment has been played in many industrial societies, and in one study that compared a number of societies, and the most generous townspeople in this study were from Boston. They gave the highest contributions and had the lowest amount of antisocial punishment. And America is a country with good respect for the rule of law. The countries and cities that came out worse in this study, with least contributions and the most antisocial punishment, were Athens and Riyadh, where perhaps there is rather less respect for the rule of law. It's found that individuals in more adverse circumstances and in more unpredictable or uncertain circumstances tend to be more cooperative. Social psychologists have found this for adverse circumstances, when people are under threat or under stress, for example. And as an example of uncertainty is in hunter-gatherer groups, for example the Arche of Paraguay. They tend to cooperate on catching game which is more uncertain, large game, and going after honey, for example, where it's very uncertain whether they're going to be successful or not, and it's in those kinds of resources that people tend to cooperate. And we can understand this in the following way, why this is so. We can draw a graph of resources in the environment. This might be the amount of fish in the sea for fishermen, or the richness of the soil for a farmer, or the amount of rainfall in the growing season. So it's either resources or, more generally, the quality of the environment. From poor at this end to getting richer and richer. And we want to see how that affects what we might call generally the benefit that there is for individuals of that. We can think of it first in terms of a single lifetime, how a single individual or a single community how their benefit would vary with the amount of resources. Well, obviously it's going to increase, but it's very likely to increase in a manner that is called with diminishing returns. That is, as the resources get greater, the advantage levels off and it reaches some ceiling. So we could draw a line something like that. So at very low quality environments, if you add a little bit more, you do much better. But at some point, when the environment becomes very rich, it really doesn't make any difference. For example, it's often said a rich man can't eat more than 3 meals a day. Yeah? And as I said, we can think of that in terms of the individual benefit for an individual. So this is how it will affect their decision making. Or we can also think of this on an evolutionary time scale, how natural selection would affect the way that people behave. Now, what we want to add to this is the effect of cooperation. So let's imagine this line is when people act individually without cooperating. If they cooperate, there's going to be a mutual benefit. So it will be above this line. So this is the non-cooperative line. But if there's some ceiling above which you really can't do better, which is very likely, then the line for cooperation is going to start higher up here, but it's going to kind of converge to that line. So that means that the advantage of cooperation is greater in poor environments, in more adverse environments, than it is in very good environments. To put it simply, if you've got it all, you don't need any help to get more. You can't do any better. The effect of unpredictability or variability of the environment can also be explained with the same graph. It's a little bit more complicated, but let's say that there's a community with a rather narrow range of environmental quality. So their environment is rather predictable. The weather is predictable, the soil conditions are predictable, say. So they have this narrow range of quality of environment. So if we take a line up to these benefit lines, it goes from there to there. So there's an improvement in benefit of that much to that much across this range here. Now take another community that has a far more unpredictable environment. Let's say it can be much poorer but also much richer. It'll have the same average, but it can be really bad or it can be really good. So it's unpredictable. Now we have a situation where the greatest increase at the low end is this. This is the greatest increase of cooperating. This is the point. How much better do you do by cooperating than not cooperating? This is the height of this black arrow here. And at the rich end, it's this. Now, as the quality of the environment gets greater and greater, the advantage of cooperation gets less and less. So as you move from a very predictable environment to an unpredictable environment, you actually lose out in terms of the best you can do, because the best you can do is that for the predictable environment, but it's rather less for the unpredictable environment. But there's not much difference up at this top end because the lines are converging, the red lines are converging. But down at this end, there's quite a large gain here, this compared with this. And this gain at the low end, at the poor end, far outweighs the loss at the good end. So the conclusion is that in an unpredictable environment, individuals do better by cooperating than in a more predictable environment. And this can work in terms of individual decision making and in terms of the way natural selection acts on our decision making over evolutionary time. There's another aspect of adversity which may go in the other direction in terms of cooperativeness, because under adverse circumstances we tend not to look so much into the future because the future is less certain. In the ultimate, we will have a shorter lifespan. And people will act in a more short-term way if they believe there is less of a future for them, less of a good future for them in particular. That can lead to short-termism, and it may also lead to a more selfish approach to potentially social interactions, because a part of that future is a social future of trustworthiness with other individuals. And it may be that, therefore, that people are being more selfish with a more short-term view. There is another way in which very adverse circumstances may show the opposite to what I've just been showing graphically. Because I think for a fuller account of what I was saying, if I can draw the graph again, I think there might, from what I was saying so far, I might have missed out a half of the answer. At the lower end, it may be that the graph should really look something like this, a rather S shape. That's the non-cooperative graph, and that's the cooperative graph. Now, I was talking about this half. Now, what happens down here? I think it's possible, but a bit more speculative, that when the environment is very adverse, things are very bad, that there is very little advantage in cooperation. You're so badly off that there is not much to be done to help you. A possible example of this is a group from Uganda, a people called the Eek, who was studied in the 1960s by Colin Turnbull. He found that the social fabric had entirely broken down. Family bonds had broken down. Young children were thrown out of the family. Old people were left to die. It was every person for themselves. There were droughts in those years when he was working. Those people were badly off at that time, but they were particularly badly off in these years. And there was the very opposite of cooperation. It was extremely selfish time. And that may be because there were so few resources. There was the best way to assure one's own survival was to be selfish, to take what food there was. There was nothing to be gained. There was, in fact, very little one could do to help others, and it was a matter of fighting for personal survival. The eat could still survive, but it may be that we don't see much of what's going on down here, because if things are really adverse, then perhaps those populations just don't survive and those cultures just fade away. These experimental games that are run by economists and psychologists to understand cooperation have uncovered 3 techniques for improving cooperation, and this has really been a big focus and aim of these experiments. For example, one can enhance cooperation by enhancing a person's concept of their reputation. Very simply, if you play these games anonymously, if the players are not known to other players, then they tend to be more selfish. If their identity is known to other players, and particularly if that then means that they can go on to play another game which they might benefit from a good reputation, then contributions to the public good increase. So reputation is one thing important. So if one can accentuate the concept of reputation in people's minds, that strengthens cooperation. A second thing is communication. Again, that chimes a bit with anonymity. If you play the game anonymously, you're not communicating with other individuals. But it's found, for example, if players are simply asked to touch another player around a table, there are increased contributions. If they just turn the head and look at them, there are increased contributions. If they have the chance to talk with them before they make their decision about how much to give to the public good, contributions increase. And the third thing that is very effective in increasing contributions, increasing cooperation in these games, is punishment. If people are allowed to pay something to punish the more selfish other individuals, and the other individuals know this, that is very effective in enhancing cooperation. So, carrots and sticks. The issue of different communities working well together is important too, as well as thinking how individuals can work together within a community. And social psychologists working, for example, in Northern Ireland with Protestant and Catholic communities are finding that simply bringing communities together, the mere contact can begin to break down the barriers, begin to break down the in-group, out-group, powerful discriminations. So that's a very simple way of allowing hostile communities to improve their relations. But it only gets you so far. And really, you need to get communities to start working together on some common issue, some common problem if you can. Now, in a sense, if you do that, that's the end goal. So you can't expect to jump right to it. But I think you want to go step by step, find some ways in which communities can do things together in some small way, and then hope for a positive feedback, that the more they work together, the easier it comes to do closer and closer things, and the more likely it is that that will become a permanent kind of resolution of the two communities.